In October 1959, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 54 years old, locked inside the most feared prison in America. He was serving a federal sentence for narcotics conspiracy, cut off from Harlem, cut off from power, surrounded by concrete, steel, and water. On Alcatraz, every man was watched, every step measured, and every mistake remembered. The prison was known for absolute control. Silence was enforced. Rules were final. Tension never left. Men ate, worked, and slept under constant pressure, knowing that weakness invited danger. This was a place where fear moved quietly, and violence waited for permission. At that time, Johnson was one of the few prisoners whose past still followed him. Even here, his name carried weight. But Alcatraz did not reward reputation. It rewarded dominance. Aggression was mistaken for strength, while patience was treated as surrender. And men who chose restraint were often tested until they broke. By the fall of 1959, Johnson had settled into prison life without incident. He kept to routine. He followed rules. He spoke only when necessary. To guards, he appeared calm. To other inmates, he appeared unmovable. He was a former Harlem crime boss who had survived shootings, arrests, and years behind bars. Those experiences had taught him control. He carried himself with quiet confidence, never rushing, never reacting in anger. In a place designed to strip men of identity, he refused to lose his sense of self. Among black prisoners, especially the younger ones, Johnson became a quiet symbol. He showed that fear was not the same as obedience, and silence was not the same as weakness. Inside a system ruled by force and intimidation, his restraint sent a message. Patience had limits, even when no one spoke them out loud. Alcatraz was not a place where history protected anyone. It was a place where men tested boundaries because there was little else left to test. For some inmates, provoking others became a way to feel alive, to feel dominant, to feel seen. And among those men, one stood apart. Erik Paulson embodied danger in its simplest form. He did not shout. He did not posture. He carried violence the way others carried routine. At 38 years old, he was already serving time for multiple murders, and that history followed him through the prison like a shadow. Other inmates knew what he was capable of. Guards knew it too. Pollson believed fear was a tool, not an emotion. He believed that race determined who could be pushed and who could not. Inside Alcatraz, he targeted black inmates with steady pressure, never all at once, never in ways that demanded immediate response. His harassment was constant, deliberate, and personal. It was designed to wear men down slowly. He studied the rhythm of the prison. He learned when guards were distracted, when noise covered words, when rules could be bent without being broken. He understood that intimidation did not need fists to be effective. And over time, he learned something more dangerous than violence itself: how to act without immediate consequence. Pollson's behavior continued because the system allowed it to continue. Alcatraz was built for control, not for resolution. The rules were strict, but enforcement was narrow. Guards focused on visible disorder: fights, refusals, disruptions. What happened quietly between inmates often went unrecorded, treated as part of prison life rather than a problem to be solved. Pollson exploited this weakness with precision. He avoided clear violations. He kept his actions just below the line that required intervention. His insults were framed as jokes. His threats were indirect. His presence alone became a warning. And because nothing appeared to escalate on paper, authority looked elsewhere. Complaints carried risk. Speaking up marked a man. Silence was safer. The system rewarded compliance, even when compliance meant enduring abuse. As long as order was maintained, the deeper damage was ignored. Over time, Pollson absorbed the lesson completely. No one was stopping him. Each day without consequence reinforced the belief that he was protected by the system's indifference. Confidence hardened into certainty, and certainty became permission. Inside a place like Alcatraz, where patience was mistaken for weakness and restraint invited challenge, that belief was not just dangerous. It was inevitable that it would lead to something final. The first incident happened during an ordinary moment, the kind designed to feel routine and controlled. It took place during a regulated movement period, when inmates lined up under watchful eyes, moving as instructed, speaking only when allowed. Nothing about the setting suggested conflict. That was the point. Without raising his voice or breaking a rule, Erik Paulson made his move. It was not a strike or a threat that demanded response. It was a calculated insult, delivered quietly, aimed to be heard only by its target. Words chosen for their meaning, not their volume. Words meant to remind, to reduce, to test. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson heard it clearly. He did not turn. He did not pause. He did not change his expression. He continued forward, exactly as before, as if nothing had been said at all. To the guards watching from a distance, nothing had happened. To the line of men around them, something had. In prison, reactions are currency. Silence is read. And restraint is rarely given the benefit of doubt. To many who witnessed the moment, Johnson's lack of response looked like surrender. The insult hung in the air unanswered, and unanswered insults have a way of inviting repetition. Pollson noticed that too. Those close to Johnson expected a different reaction. They expected a look, a word, some sign that the line had been drawn. Johnson's past was known. His reputation, though muted by prison walls, still carried weight among those who paid attention. Silence, to them, felt dangerous. But the restraint was deliberate. Johnson understood the environment better than most. He knew Alcatraz did not reward immediate reaction. He knew that the first man to move was often the first man punished. He also knew that responding too soon turned a test into a spectacle, and a spectacle into a loss. Those who truly understood the prison saw something else entirely. They recognized patience not as fear, but as calculation. In places like Alcatraz, timing mattered more than strength. A man who moved too early gave the system an excuse to intervene. A man who waited controlled the outcome. Johnson was not ignoring the insult. He was measuring it. And in doing so, he was allowing those watching to draw their own conclusions. Some mistaken, some dangerous. The kind of misunderstandings that, inside a place like this, never stayed small for long. The next incident occurred 2 days later in the recreation yard. The yard was one of the few open spaces on Alcatraz, a narrow stretch of concrete where men walked in circles under guard towers. It was where tension surfaced quietly, through looks and posture rather than action. Pollson positioned himself close enough to Johnson to be felt, not touched. This time the provocation was clearer. A remark meant to humiliate. A reminder that the first insult had gone unanswered. Again Johnson did nothing. He kept walking. His face remained calm. To Pollson, the silence confirmed a belief already forming. A day later it happened again, this time in the laundry room. The air was thick with heat and noise from the machines. Guards moved in and out. Pollson chose the moment carefully. He interfered with Johnson's workspace, crowding him, forcing contact just short of a violation. The provocation was worse now. It was physical but still deniable. Johnson stepped aside and continued his task. No words. No reaction. Each time restraint was shown, Pollson's confidence grew. He began to see Johnson not as a man choosing control, but as a man who could be pushed. In a place like Alcatraz, that belief was dangerous. The third incident came midweek in a corridor near the library. Movement was slow. Sound carried. Pollson spoke louder this time, ensuring others could hear. The insult was no longer subtle. It was meant to draw attention, to establish dominance in front of witnesses. Johnson paused briefly, then continued forward. Still nothing. To some, the pause looked like hesitation. To Pollson, it looked like permission. By the fourth incident, the pattern was clear. In the mess hall line, Pollson cut close, whispered something deliberate, something meant to sting deeper than before. The provocation was now public enough to humiliate, but still framed to avoid immediate discipline. Johnson remained restrained. Each incident followed the same structure. Pressure, silence, withdrawal. And each time, Pollson learned that the line could be pushed further. Confidence turned into routine. Routine turned into entitlement. In environments like this, entitlement becomes threat. The fifth incident occurred near the cell block during evening movement. Pollson blocked Johnson's path for a moment longer than necessary. No words this time, just presence. Just a test of space and control. Guards were nearby. Pollson stepped away at the last second, smiling. Johnson said nothing. By the end of the week, Pollson no longer viewed Johnson as an equal. He viewed him as a symbol to be broken. And symbols, once chosen, are rarely left alone. Everything changed when Pollson involved someone else. The younger prisoner was black, newer to Alcatraz, and less experienced with its unwritten rules. He stood closer to Johnson than most, drawn by the older man's calm and consistency. Pollson noticed this, and he understood what it meant. The incident occurred during another routine movement period. Pollson redirected his behavior away from Johnson and toward the younger inmate. The harassment was sharper, more open, designed to provoke fear rather than test restraint. It was no longer symbolic. It was personal. Johnson saw it happen. This incident crossed a line, not because it was louder, but because it targeted someone who had no protection. Turned intimidation into cruelty, and it made the silence around it impossible to justify. Authority response was minimal. Guards intervened just enough to restore order, issuing no serious discipline. No report followed. No warning that mattered. The system treated it as another minor disruption, quickly forgotten. But it was not forgotten. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. Johnson understood that restraint had been misread, and that patience had reached its limit. Pollson, emboldened by the lack of consequence, believed he had proven his dominance. Both men walked away from that moment with certainty. And in places like Alcatraz, certainty is the last thing that changes before everything does. That evening, Alcatraz settled into its familiar quiet. The sounds were the same as always. Distant footsteps, metal doors closing, the low hum of a prison preparing for night. Lights dimmed in stages. Voices dropped. Men returned to their cells carrying the weight of another day that had demanded endurance without relief. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat calmly, as he always did. Nothing about his posture suggested anger. Nothing in his expression signaled urgency. But those closest to him noticed a change. Not in emotion, but in finality. The patience that had defined his week was no longer active. It had concluded. When he spoke, it was quiet, almost casual. There was no audience, only a small circle of men who understood how prisons worked and what silence usually meant. He did not raise his voice. He did not name anyone directly. He did not describe violence. He simply stated what would happen next. There was no emotion in the words. No anger. No pride. Just certainty. He spoke as a man who had waited long enough and reached a decision that could not be undone. The tone was calm, measured, and final. Those who heard him did not respond right away. In prison, words like that are not debated. They are weighed. Each man listening understood the meaning without explanation. Johnson was not asking for approval. He was not gathering support. He was marking the end of something. He did not say when. He did not say how. He did not say where. He did not need to. In places like Alcatraz, certainty carries more weight than threat. Threats invite attention. Certainty invites distance. The men around him understood that what had been restrained all week was no longer being held back. It had simply been delayed. That night passed without incident. No alarms. No sudden movement. No change in routine. But for those who had heard Johnson speak, the quiet felt different. It was no longer neutral. It was transitional. Something had already ended. The rest was timing. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. It took place during a regulated meal period, inside the prison cafeteria. Long tables, fixed seating, guards positioned at their usual posts, trays passed down the line, utensils counted and monitored, movement controlled and predictable. Nothing about the room suggested violence. That was by design. The cafeteria was meant to be orderly, almost dull. A place where routine reduced risk and repetition enforced control. Men sat, ate, and rose on schedule. Conversations were muted. Every sound echoed. That morning, routine continued exactly as expected. Johnson entered with the others. His movements were steady, his expression unchanged. He did not scan the room. He did not hesitate. He took his place and followed procedure like any other day. Erik Paulson was there too. He moved with confidence that had grown all week. Confidence built not from strength, but from the absence of consequence. Each prior incident had taught him the same lesson. Nothing would happen. The system would not stop him. Johnson would not stop him. To Pollson, this was just another opportunity. The guards watched as they always did, trained to spot sudden motion, raised voices, visible disruption. They saw nothing unusual. The room functioned as intended. The system believed itself intact. That contrast is what made what followed unforgettable. Because when violence comes from chaos, it feels expected. But when it emerges from order, clean, fast, and controlled, it leaves a different mark. It forces recognition, cannot be dismissed as accident or impulse. In that cafeteria, under bright lights and strict rules, nothing appeared out of place. Until it was. The cafeteria was already in motion when he did it. Trays slid across metal rails. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Guards stood in their usual places, eyes moving in practice patterns, trained to notice disruption, not intent. The room felt controlled, predictable, safe by institutional standards. Pollson chose that moment precisely because of that. He moved close enough to Johnson to be unmistakable. This time he did not lower his voice. He did not hide behind deniability. The words were spoken clearly, meant to be heard, meant to land. The insult carried the same hatred as before, but now it was sharpened by confidence. It was a declaration, not a test. For the first time, there was no ambiguity. Men at nearby tables stopped eating. Some looked down. Others froze mid-motion. They understood what was happening even if they did not want to witness it. The room did not grow loud. It grew still. Johnson looked up. For days, he had absorbed pressure without reaction. He had allowed silence to do its work. But this moment was different. The line that had been crossed earlier in the week was now being trampled openly, in front of everyone, under the protection of routine and rules. Johnson stood. The movement was calm and deliberate. No sudden motion. No visible anger. Just the simple act of rising from his seat. In that instant, the room shifted. Guards noticed. Inmates felt it. Pollson, still confident, did not step back. He believed this was another moment that would end the same way. He was wrong. According to witnesses, everything happened in seconds. Johnson moved with precision, not haste. The action was controlled, direct, and intentional. There was no struggle, no exchange of blows, no chaos spilling across the room. What occurred was fast and contained, the kind of violence that ends something rather than escalates it. Before guards could close the distance, before orders could be shouted, the outcome was already decided. The weapon, concealed and simple, was used once, decisively. There was no repetition, no excess. The act was surgical, not explosive. The room erupted only after it was over. Chairs overturned. Trays clattered to the floor. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, voices sharp with command. Johnson stepped back immediately. He did not resist. He did not flee. He did not need to. He stood still as authority reclaimed the space. The violence had lasted only moments, but its impact settled heavily over the room. It was clear to everyone present that this had not been an accident, nor a loss of control. It had been a conclusion, and it was already finished. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stopped immediately. There was no attempt to continue, no effort to escape the moment he had created. As guards closed in, he stepped back, hands visible, posture steady. The noise of the cafeteria, shouts, orders, the scrape of boots, surrounded him, but he did not add to it. The action had ended because it was meant to end there. He did not resist authority. When officers reached him, Johnson complied without hesitation. He allowed himself to be restrained. There was no argument, no explanation offered, No plea. His face showed neither anger nor relief. What needed to be done had been done. The rest was procedure. As he was prepared to be removed from the room, Johnson spoke once. It was not a threat. It was not loud. It was not meant for the guards. It was directed toward those who had been watching all week, those who had seen silence mistaken for weakness and patience tested beyond its limit. The words were brief and final, carrying no emotion beyond certainty. Those who heard him understood exactly what he meant. The guards escorted him out, restoring order behind them. The cafeteria fell into a heavy quiet, not because silence was demanded, but because no one felt the need to speak. The moment had passed, but its meaning remained. Erik Paulson survived, but he did not walk away unchanged. The injuries were severe and permanent. His face bore the mark of the encounter, and he lost vision in one eye. The confidence that had defined his presence in the prison vanished overnight. He was removed from the general population, no longer free to move through the space he had once dominated. More importantly, his behavior ended. Across Alcatraz, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Harassment stopped. Intimidation faded. The daily pressure that had been applied quietly to black inmates eased, not because rules changed, but because belief changed. The idea that abuse would go unanswered no longer held. The guards did not announce new policies. The administration did not issue statements. The system remained the same on paper, but the environment was different. Men who had relied on silence to protect them began to feel safer. Men who had relied on fear lost their leverage. The message required no repetition. Everyone understood it in their own way. Some saw it as consequence. Others saw it as correction. But no one misunderstood it. In a place designed to erase individuality, a single controlled act had reset the balance. Johnson was sent to solitary confinement for 30 days. It was punishment but not escalation. Investigators reviewed the pattern leading up to the incident. The repeated provocation, the lack of intervention, the final public escalation. No additional sentence was added. The conclusion was clear enough. When Johnson returned, he returned quietly. There were no celebrations, no recognition, no words exchanged, but the space around him had changed. He was no longer tested. No one mistook his restraint again. His patience was understood for what it had always been. A choice, not a limitation. The prison continued as it always had. Meals were served. Counts were taken. Lights went out on schedule. But beneath the routine, something had shifted permanently. In Alcatraz, where order was enforced but justice was not guaranteed, the balance had been corrected not by the system, but by the certainty of consequence. And that certainty lingered long after the echoes of the cafeteria had faded. In the days that followed, the prison returned to order on the surface. Counts were taken. Reports were filed. Schedules resumed. But beneath the routine, the incident did not disappear. It was examined quietly, carefully, and in full. When the events were reviewed, a pattern emerged. It did not begin in the cafeteria. It began days earlier, with small incidents that were easy to dismiss on their own. Words spoken softly. Space invaded without touch. Pressure applied just below the level that demanded response. Each moment taken alone appeared minor. Together, they formed a progression. Investigators noted the repetition. The same antagonist. The same targets. The same locations chosen for deniability. Each incident increased in clarity and boldness. Each one tested limits that were never enforced. The record showed no sudden explosion, only steady buildup. There were warnings, not formal complaints, not written grievances, but signs that experienced eyes recognized. Shifts in behavior, tension observed by guards, patterns noticed by inmates who had learned to read danger before it announced itself. The system had been given time to intervene. It did not. System failure was not dramatic. It was quiet. It appeared as indifference, as routine, as an unwillingness to act without overt violation. Authority focused on control rather than protection. Harassment that did not disrupt order was allowed to continue. The review made that clear. By the time the final incident occurred, The conditions had already been set. Restraint had been misread. Silence had been interpreted as consent. The institution had permitted confidence to grow unchecked. The conclusion was unavoidable. Ellsworth Johnson's response was not spontaneous. It was not reckless. It followed a visible sequence of provocation and neglect. While discipline was applied, escalation was not. The investigation closed without additional sentencing, not as an endorsement of violence, but as an acknowledgement of cause. The system did not correct itself in time. Someone else did. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate, passed quietly inmate to inmate, generation to generation. It was not told loudly. It was not embellished. There was no need to exaggerate what had already carried consequence. The details stayed simple. The meaning did not require decoration. It endured not because of spectacle. There was no chaos to glorify, no prolonged struggle, no excess. The violence, brief and controlled, was almost beside the point. What mattered was the timing. What mattered was the restraint that came before it. The story stayed alive because of what it explained. It explained how silence can be mistaken for weakness, how patience, when misunderstood, invites testing, how systems built on order can fail to protect those within them, and how, in rare moments, certainty replaces noise. In places like this, survival is not about dominance. It is about judgment, knowing when to endure, knowing when endurance has reached its limit, knowing that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The story remained because it carried a final truth. When protection fails, consequence becomes instruction. In environments where silence is enforced and restraint is misread, the absence of response is never permanent.